He once refused to sit on a park bench until an assistant wiped it down 3 separate times in front of people he was trying to impress, at the risk of making the whole encounter deeply uncomfortable for everyone involved. Not because the bench was actually dirty, because admitting he could simply sit down and let something be slightly imperfect felt, to Niles Crane, like admitting he might not be as impressive as he needed everyone to believe. Niles Crane never needed things to be perfect. He needed proof he wasn't the lesser Crane brother. Welcome back to the Character Couch. I've rewatched this show enough times to predict every fussy aside before it lands, and for years I laughed at Niles, the same way everyone does. The fastidious, wine-obsessed psychiatrist who can't handle a wrinkled napkin. But you don't just see a man with impossibly high standards. You see someone who has spent his entire life quietly competing with his own brother for a sense of worth neither of them ever received enough of growing up. By the end of this video, every fussy, exacting habit Niles Crane has ever displayed is going to look a lot less like snobbery and a lot more like a lifelong search for approval he never quite got. There's a term for what Niles does. Psychologists describe this as compensatory perfectionism, a pattern where impossibly high standards for wine, for decor, for one's own appearance function as a shield against a much deeper, quieter fear of being fundamentally not good enough. It isn't really about the wrinkled napkin or the dusty bench. It's about a man who learned early that being flawless was the safest way to avoid a comparison he never felt confident he could win. Niles doesn't demand perfection because he enjoys high standards. He demands it because falling short, even slightly, has always felt like proof of something he's spent his whole life trying to disprove. Martin Crane is a retired blue-collar Seattle police officer, plain-spoken and unpretentious, a man who prefers beer and ball games to opera and imported wine. His sons, Niles and Frasier, grew up under his roof and somehow emerged with tastes and sensibilities almost entirely foreign to him, a gap the show minds for comedy, but which carries real weight underneath it. For Niles specifically, that gap seems to have produced something more anxious than simple cultural difference. Martin rarely expresses approval in the refined language his sons crave, offering blunt affection instead of the eloquent validation Niles seems to be constantly, quietly auditioning for. Niles doesn't just want his father to notice his accomplishments. He seems to need Martin's approval to feel like his elevated tastes and achievements actually mean something, rather than simply being another way of setting himself apart from where he came from. That specific hunger, wanting validation from someone who doesn't speak the language Niles has spent his life perfecting, sets up a rivalry that would define much of his adult identity. Niles and Frasier's mother, Hester, appears only in memory throughout the series, having died before the show begins. She was, notably, a practicing psychiatrist herself, analytical and precise, a woman both sons remember with genuine affection, but also subtly, as someone who related to her children's emotions more through clinical interpretation than straightforward warmth. Growing up with a mother who was professionally trained to analyze feelings rather than simply express them seems to have modeled something specific for Niles. That emotional experiences are things to be understood, categorized, and perfected, rather than simply felt and accepted as messy and imperfect. It's not hard to see how a boy raised by a psychiatrist mother and a police officer father, two very different but equally exacting worldviews, might grow into an adult obsessed with getting everything exactly right. That inheritance, precision as a stand-in for genuine emotional ease, followed Niles directly into the rivalry that would consume much of his adult life. Niles and Frasier's relationship is defined by a decades-long, largely good-natured but unmistakably real competition over restaurant recommendations, wine knowledge, professional accomplishments. Nearly anything either of them can turn into a contest. On the surface, it plays as affectionate sibling rivalry between two erudite brothers. Underneath, it reveals two men still quietly measuring themselves against each other for a sense of worth neither entirely received enough of at home. Neither brother is straightforwardly the more successful or more loved. That's precisely the problem. Without a clear winner, the competition simply never resolves, forcing Niles into an exhausting, permanent state of trying to be slightly more refined, slightly more accomplished, slightly more impressive than the one person whose opinion of him matters more than almost anyone else's. That rivalry becomes the emotional engine behind nearly every fussy, competitive impulse Niles displays elsewhere in his life, including in the marriage that defines so much of his early adulthood. Niles's first wife, Maris, is a recurring presence throughout the series despite never once appearing on screen, an extraordinarily wealthy, controlling, and by every account deeply cold woman who dominates Niles's early adult life. Their marriage is depicted as miserable, almost from the start, and yet Niles remains devoted to her, defensive of her, for years longer than seems to make any sense from the outside. That devotion makes more sense once you consider what Maris represents. Access to exactly the elevated, moneyed world Niles has been quietly trying to prove he belongs in since childhood. Leaving Maris wouldn't just end an unhappy marriage. It would mean giving up the social validation her family's wealth and status provided, the closest thing Niles had found to concrete proof that he'd successfully become someone impressive. It takes years and considerable unhappiness before Niles finally risks giving that validation up for a woman who offers him something he'd never quite experienced before: being loved without needing to perform anything at all. Niles's love for Daphne Moon, Martin's live-in physical therapist, develops slowly over years of the show, mostly hidden, mostly unspoken, a source of both comedy and genuine longing. What makes this relationship different from Maris is immediately obvious. Daphne is warm, unpretentious, entirely unconcerned with the refined image Niles has spent his life curating. For a man whose sense of worth has always been tied to being impressive enough, loving someone who doesn't particularly care about wine vintages or perfectly pressed suits is genuinely disorienting. Niles doesn't pursue Daphne through performance the way he might have pursued Maris's social circle. He simply quietly wants her for years without any of his usual need to prove himself first. That shift, wanting someone for reasons that have nothing to do with status, represents the clearest evidence that some part of Niles always suspected his perfectionism was covering for something, even before he consciously understood what. After his divorce from Maris, Niles's second marriage, to fellow dentist Mel Karnofsky, initially seems like a fresh start. But Mel gradually reveals herself to be possessive and controlling in ways that echo Maris more than Niles perhaps wants to admit, jealous of his continued feelings for Daphne, demanding in her own way of exactly the kind of performance Niles has spent his life providing. That repetition is the important detail. Niles doesn't simply learn from Maris and choose someone entirely different the second time. He nearly recreates the same dynamic, suggesting that some part of him still associates being wanted with being controlled, a pattern comfortable enough, however unhappy, to default back into without fully realizing it. It takes the specific, hard-won clarity of his feelings for Daphne to finally break that cycle completely, rather than simply repeating it a third time. Niles's friendship with Roz Doyle, Frasier's radio producer, develops into one of the more unexpectedly genuine relationships in the show, given how different their social worlds initially seem. Roz is direct, unpretentious, and utterly unimpressed by Niles's fussiness, teasing him about it constantly rather than indulging it the way his social circle typically does. That directness turns out to be exactly what Niles needs from a friendship. Someone who likes him without requiring the performance, who calls out his neuroses with affection rather than judgment, and who never once seems interested in whether his wine collection or his tailoring measures up to anyone else's. Their friendship offers a low-stakes version of exactly what Daphne eventually offers romantically, acceptance that doesn't require impressiveness as an entry fee. That kind of ease, rare everywhere else in his life, says a great deal about how much effort Niles usually puts into being liked, and how relieving it is on the occasions he doesn't have to. To understand Niles fully, it helps to understand the specific social world he spent his adult life trying to belong to. Seattle's old-money social scene, private clubs, symphony patrons, exclusive dinner parties, operates on unspoken rules about breeding and pedigree that a police officer's son, however cultured he becomes, can never fully inherit by birth. Niles's meticulous attention to wine vintages, tailoring, and etiquette isn't simple snobbery. It's an ongoing, exhausting effort to compensate for an origin story that this specific social world quietly never lets him fully forget. No amount of expertise entirely erases the fact that he wasn't born into it, and that gap between earned sophistication and inherited status is precisely the kind of insecurity compensatory perfectionism is built to manage. That social anxiety explains why Niles's fussiness so often intensifies specifically around wealthy, high-status company, the exact audience whose acceptance he's least able to simply take for granted. There's a second layer of context worth examining. Niles comes from a family where both his mother and his brother are psychiatrists, a household that has spent decades treating emotional analysis as a profession rather than simply a private experience. That environment shapes a particular relationship to feeling. Emotions become subjects to be diagnosed and refined, rather than things to be sat with imperfectly. Growing up surrounded by that clinical framework helps explain why Niles processes so much of his own emotional life through performance and precision, rather than straightforward expression. If your household's entire professional expertise is built on analyzing why people feel what they feel, it's a short step to believing your own feelings need to be managed, presented, and perfected, rather than simply experienced. That family culture, more than any single relationship, may be the deepest root of why Niles turned emotional vulnerability into something to curate, rather than something to simply allow. Niles's relationship with his nephew Frederick, Frasier's son, is one of the show's quieter, more consistently tender dynamics. Niles dotes on Frederick without any of his usual anxious perfectionism creeping into the relationship, offering an uncomplicated, generous kind of affection that rarely appears elsewhere in his adult life. That ease matters. Frederick doesn't require Niles to compete, perform, or prove sophistication. He's simply a child who likes his uncle, and Niles, notably, doesn't seem to need to earn that affection through refinement the way he does with nearly every adult in his orbit. It's a small, easily overlooked relationship, but it suggests that Niles's perfectionism was never really about children or about unconditional bonds. It was specifically about adult approval and the specific insecurities only adult comparison could trigger. Throughout his marriage to Maris, Niles maintains a circle of wealthy, socially prominent acquaintances, people who accept him primarily as Maris's husband rather than as Niles Crane individually. These relationships are largely transactional, built on shared status markers rather than genuine warmth, and they quietly evaporate once his marriage ends. That evaporation is telling. If those friendships had been built on real affection for Niles himself, at least some of them might have survived his divorce. Instead, they reveal exactly how conditional that entire social world's acceptance of him actually was. Accepted as an accessory to wealth and status rather than valued as a person in his own right. Losing that circle, painful as it initially seems, ultimately clears space for the relationships built on something sturdier, the ones that don't disappear the moment his usefulness to someone else's image runs out. But here's the part that caught me completely off guard. Frasier, the one everyone frames as the more successful, more accomplished brother, the one Niles has spent decades quietly measuring himself against, he's also, and I cannot believe I'm saying this, someone who needed Niles's rivalry just as desperately as Niles needed his. Think about it. Frasier's entire identity is built on being the more sophisticated, more publicly respected Crane brother, a radio psychiatrist performing wisdom for an audience of listeners he's never met. Having Niles constantly nearby, equally cultured, equally competitive, gave Frasier something he needed just as badly. A mirror sophisticated enough to make his own accomplishments feel meaningful by comparison, rather than simply performed into a microphone alone. So the brother everyone assumes was simply enduring Niles's fussy one-upmanship all these years was actually relying on it too, using Niles as the one audience whose approval could make his own carefully built refinement feel like it actually mattered, rather than just another performance for strangers. What Niles deserved, back in that house with a father who spoke a different emotional language and a mother who analyzed feelings instead of simply sharing them, was proof that he didn't have to be flawless to be enough. Not a perfectly pressed suit. Not a bench wiped down 3 times before he'd risk sitting on it. What he actually received was a lifetime of quietly measuring himself against a brother equally hungry for the same validation, in a family that rarely handed either of them enough of it to spare. He built an entire personality out of precision, so no one could ever point to a flaw and confirm what he privately feared about himself. He built it so well, he nearly missed the one woman who never once needed him to be flawless at all, and in Daphne's plain, unimpressed affection, in Roz's teasing acceptance, in a nephew who loved him without any performance required, that was the boy still trying to prove himself worthy, finally quietly, discovering he already was. The wine was never about the wine, it never was. So was Niles Crane simply a snob, or a man drowning in insecurity? Neither, honestly. Niles wasn't a naturally superior man who happened to enjoy fine things, and he wasn't an insecure man merely performing sophistication for effect. He was someone who turned a lifetime of quiet comparison to a father, a mother, and a brother into an entire identity built on never giving anyone a reason to find him lacking. Maybe that's truer of more of us than we'd like to admit. Sometimes the person with the highest standards for everyone else is simply the one who spent the longest time terrified of what happens if he ever falls short of his own. So here's what I want to know. If Niles had grown up in a family that gave him approval freely, without the constant comparison to Frasier, do you think he still becomes a man who needs everything to be perfect? Or was that need always going to find him somewhere, given the household that raised him? Let me know in the comments. And if you want more of these deep dives into the characters you thought you already understood, hit subscribe. The couch is always open.